And Mugabe has just announced a multi-billion-dollar
I want Bjorn to
clean
speak,
tech.
and then I want to go to questions.
Yes.
Gentlemen up there,
And,
get ready.
and the bottom line is, if Hunter is right and everybody makes money off of this, cool, we can all go home. We don't need to worry about it because it'll happen. Absolutely. But the real question is,
no, it won't,
we
because
know,
we invest $240 billion a year in subsidies to the conventional technologies.
Right.
And that's what's getting in the way of unleashing this new energy economy.
No. The real point here is to say, are we going to go further than that? And we know, and this is of course also what you accept, we know that the emission scenarios expect dramatic increases in CO2. And what you're saying is, over and above all these great inventions that you described and everybody else has been talking on the other side of the panel, over and above that, we have to cut dramatically. That's what costs money. That's the discussion that we're having here tonight.
Gentlemen
honestly,
in the middle of the hall,
real
please.
question is that worth it?
Yes,
and
come on
my
out.
question is still, are we spending trillions of dollars to do virtually no good 100 years from now? I'm sorry, Oliver, that's not
We're
actually
going to a question now.
misrepresenting
Gentlemen.
science.
You know, it's clear that this is a global problem. Everybody agrees on that. But impacts and return on investment do matter. So in the face of 3 to 4% GDP, I'd like to ask the folks who are arguing against the motion, what in a legal context or an enforceability, from an enforceability standpoint, would you expect that we can actually do about China, India, and the developing world?
Adam Werbach.
Well, the first false choice that is placed here is deciding that China needs to be constrained first. I mean, the greatest challenge, and I think Mr. Lomborg and I would agree here, the greatest challenge that facing the people of China is that too many of them don't have enough energy. They need a lot more of it. And we have a moral, a just cause to make sure that everyone can live on the planet. There'll be 9 billion of us by 2040 with enough energy to be able to live. So I actually far expect our carbon emissions to increase, recession, depression notwithstanding right now, as we try to get those people to energy parity. They live in energy deficit. And our first priority, one of the reasons I believe so much in investing right now, is because we need to create technologies that can make the case. Now, what type of constraints will be put on China? Well, China obviously is interested in that as well. And China, as it begins to invest and succeed, as Hunter mentioned, in one of their entrepreneurs, in building these sort of renewable technologies, is going to be very interested in dealing with the air pollution, because in Chinese cities, they're very concerned about air pollution right now, and they know that comes from coal plants, and they're concerned about dealing with that. So they're highly motivated to reach the point of energy parity, a place where everyone has enough energy, and then to ratchet down both the CO2 emissions, the air particulate matter emissions, and all those sorts of negative consequences that come from it.
Peter Huber, do you mind?
You know, there is no field of policy you will ever find, and I spent 25 years in watching this, in Washington watching this, where you will find a greater gap between what people actually do and what they say they're gonna do, want to do, should do, ought to do. The EU itself, the people who are most frantic about this and who signed this stuff, none of them, or possibly one of them, will meet their Kyoto commitments. They issued tradable permits and promptly depressed the value to virtually zero because they issued so many. They were all worried about job export issues. I mean, you know, you just cannot take talk about what people are going to do for anything. China is, in fact, building coal plants like crazy, okay? They say they're going to build more, but I couldn't care less what they say. They are actually doing it. They are the world's biggest emitter today. How can you ignore the world's biggest emitter?
Well, I mean, there's a few things to remember here, and surely one key thing is that a very large part of this coal that's being burnt in China is actually producing products for export to America and to the European Union.
And so your tax our plans, but not theirs, right?
And it's important to recognize that. Another thing, let's look at what China is actually doing. China is investing hugely in renewables. China's already got the world's biggest solar and photovoltaic industries. China is investing hugely in wind turbines. They are building more and more of the world's turbines and bringing the cost of turbines down. And yes, they may indeed be mining more coal, but much of that is surely displacing imports
Phillip Stott, then
from
Hunter Lovins.
Indonesia and Australia.
Well, I don't want to talk about. Let me just mention briefly Europe. An absolute failure under the Kyoto Protocol. Talks a lot.
We're not debating Kyoto.
No. What we're debating is the effectiveness of major costs. Europe has failed utterly for economic and political reasons to cut. Some of the figures from Spain, from Italy, from Ireland are just mind-blowing. And this is what we're in a cloud cuckoo land here. And let me just point about this. We worry about China. Yeah, Worry about the EU now on this. Half the EU now is opposing the EU's policy on cutting carbon. Listen to the Czech president, for example, Václav Klaus, who's the current president of the EU. Why do you think the recent EU policies have collapsed virtually? Don't think it's just China or India. Don't take what Europe says. Europe talks, but it's not walking the walk.
Hunter Lovins, please. Hunter Lovins against the motion.
You know what's going to get China to cut its carbon emissions? It's not going to be you and me, and it's not going to be the government. It's going to be Walmart, which recently said to its Chinese suppliers, you will report your carbon footprint through a little group called the Carbon Disclosure Project. Who are they? It's a little group, little nonprofit out of the UK that a few years back sent out a survey to the Financial Times 500 biggest companies on Earth, saying, what's your carbon footprint? And for a couple of years, everybody ignored it until 3 years ago when 60% of the world's largest companies answered the survey. Last year, it was 77%. Why? They represent institutional investors with over $41 trillion in assets. You're going to go to the capital marketplace, you better answer their survey. And under Sarbanes-Oxley, the new U.S. corporate ethics law, if as a manager you fail to disclose to shareholders information that can materially affect the value of stock, you can be personally criminally liable. What's your carbon footprint? Watch China's emissions start to come down. Simply because that's the way the best companies are doing business now.
I love the way you think that Walmart is actually going to go and say, oh, they produce a lot of carbon. Let's buy stuff that costs a lot more from someone who don't produce as much carbon. Obviously, Walmart can do that, but I don't think they'll stay in business. Let me also just point out two things. I thought it was very rare to see that Adam was actually, I'm not sure to what extent it was conscious, but he was actually agreeing with us, which is really nice. You should come over here. He was basically saying China is going to go and emit much, much more. Then they're going to be careful and they're going to care a lot about air pollution. That's absolutely true. Then he sort of slipped in and they're going to cut carbon emissions. No, of course not. They're going to put scrubbers on their coal plants, which is really smart. They're not going to care about their carbon emissions for a long term. And I'd just like the last point also. Do you remember how Hunter told us about the first Chinese billionaire as a guy who produces solar panels? Do you know who he sells those solar panels to? He sells them to Germany. They've actually bought $156 billion worth of solar panels. Do you know how much good that's going to do? By the end of the century, that will postpone global warming by 1 hour. I'm simply asking you, is that the way we want to help the world?
I'm going to go to a question there.
This is complete rubbish because Germany has been doing the most enormous favour to the world by buying these panels, by getting them into mass production and by driving down the cost for everybody.
Question from the rear.
Germany has the biggest brown coal plants in the world, the single most polluting coal plants.
I want to move on. Question from the rear, please.